The potential breakdown in U.S.-Saudi relations, the upcoming elections in Israel, and of course, the extraordinary developments between Israel and Lebanon on the offshore gas fields. But nonetheless, Iraq still remains at the center of concerns about the Middle East, given its history, given its extraordinary role in production of hydrocarbons, second in OPEC, and potentially in the future a competitor even to Saudi Arabia. It's thus, if you will, a huge prize for whoever can control it, and that should be the people of Iraq, but may not necessarily be so. And that's what we're going to do today with the help of the Enabling Peace in Iraq Center, headed by Omar al-Nadawi. We're going to look at recent polling that will give us insight into what people in Iraq are thinking today, particularly among youth, and how this will impact or potentially impact the future of the country. And we'll be joined today with our own Middle East Program fellow, Genev Abdo. So now I'll turn it over to you, Omar, and take it from there, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Jeffrey, for the kind introduction and the insightful remarks, and thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting this discussion. Good morning, everyone. My name is Omar Nadawi, and I'm the Director of Programs at Enabling Peace in Iraq Center, and I'll be moderating this discussion. I want to welcome our panelists who are joining us today for this discussion on the views among young Iraqis on religion and secularism in governance. We have two brilliant Iraqi analysts, Hamza Haddad, a fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we have from Baghdad, Sajjad Jiyad, a fellow at the Century Foundation and the director of Shia Politics Working Group. And with us here in the room is my colleague and collaborator in developing this research project, Genev Abdo, a fellow here at the Wilson Center's Middle East program. Genev, it's been an honor working with you on this program for about 8 months, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Before we start, I would like to thank two organizations whose support made this research possible, the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany and Digital Consulting Engineers, which is an Iraqi private firm that's trying to support democracy building efforts through their sustainability office. And I also want to acknowledge my dear colleagues at our organization's office in Erbil, because they are the people who made the survey possible. So this was truly an international effort. I want to start by giving a little bit of background about the research. And it goes back to Iraq's political system post-2003. This system, which started with the toppling of Saddam Hussein's regime after the US-led invasion, has been governed by the unwritten rules of muhassasa, the system of ethno-sectarian power sharing that has dominated and penetrated every corner and level of Iraq's government. Now, in recent years, Iraqis have been expressing growing frustration with the political dysfunction, corruption, and poor economic conditions which they blame largely on the effects of muhassasa. And this frustration has boiled over, really, in multiple times in recent years, in 2015, 2016, 2018, and most remarkably in 2019, when we saw hundreds of thousands of Iraqis join the so-called Tishreen Revolution of October 2019, filling the squares of Baghdad and Nasiriyah and towns across southern Iraq, primarily demanding change. Those were mostly young protesters, and they were seen as a serious threat to the powers of the status quo. So serious that these powers used horrific acts of violence and intimidation to kill hundreds, maim thousands, and disappear many, many innocent people. It was crystal clear that these protesters want the political parties and the political system to be gone. Most of these political parties are Islamist parties. Others have used other subnational identities to hijack the representation of their communities and to stay in power. One anecdote illustrating those feelings is the chant Bismiddin Bagon al-Haramiyya, in the name of religion, the thieves have robbed us, which Iraqi protesters have chanted for many years, especially in the South. But it wasn't clear what kind of system these protesters wanted to replace the current one, and what role, if any, would they want for religion and religious authorities in a new system. Ideas like al-dawla al-madaniyya, or the civil state, can mean different things to different people. And after all, this was and continues to be a very diverse social movement. This is not a monolithic group of protesters. The calls for change have come from and have brought together people from all walks of life in Iraq. Day laborers from impoverished neighborhoods of Baghdad, poets, artists, college students, even high school students, and leftist activists and urban elites from more affluent neighborhoods. Now, not surprisingly, such a diverse group would have would express very different and often nuanced views about religious authorities, such as Grand Ayatollah Ali Sistani, who has been perhaps the most influential figure in Iraq since 2003. These questions and uncertainties really demanded a closer look into important questions like, how do young Iraqis, being the backbone of the protest movement and the most important voice demanding change, how do they view the role of religion in politics and in other aspects of public life? And how do these young people view the role of clerics, senior or otherwise, in state affairs? And what are their ideas on how to replace the system of muhasab that has proven to be quite dysfunctional? To get answers to these questions and other related ones, my organization, EPIC, has conducted a nationwide survey in July of this year, which involved interviews with a representative sample of 1,062 Iraqis, focusing on the age groups of 18 to 40, again, young Iraqis, from all of Iraq's 18 provinces. And the responses, some of which were expected, some of which less so, were then gathered, analyzed, and presented in a report that is being released today. This report, which is available at enablingpeace.org, was written by my colleague Genevieve Abdu, who's a true expert on sectarian conflict and sectarian politics in the region. Genevieve, would you like to walk us through some of the key findings and perhaps put those in context for the audience?
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning to those of you here and those on Zoom. And I'd like to thank the Middle East team here at the Wilson Center for putting on such a terrific event, and also for Omar and EPIC for conducting the survey. Before I get to the most important findings, I thought it would be helpful to sort of discuss the central message of the poll in a regional context. So as Omar mentioned, those who were surveyed are relatively young. They're no older than 40 years old. They live in urban areas, and they're relatively educated. And these Iraqis basically said the central message of the survey was that they want a secular form of governance with a clear separation between religion and state. Now, if we look at how this has played out in the region over the last decade, it's pretty consistent with what we have seen from young demonstrators, beginning with the Arab uprisings, and until today. As we speak today, there are thousands of young Iranians on the streets protesting the theocratic state in Iran, which has, of course, been in power over 40 years. So I would say that the findings are consistent with trends that we've seen in the Middle East over at least a decade, with the exception, of course, of the Muslim Brotherhood's rise to power in Egypt. And I think that we saw a very complex dynamic, political, social dynamic when the Brotherhood came to power, because, of course, it had been a movement that had existed since 1928. So I think that we have to put that sort of example aside when looking at the trends toward what I would say is really secular nationalism. And we see this in the protest movement in Iraq that continues today, the slogans. It's not just about divorcing religion from the state, but it's also about creating a nationalist identity. And I would say that Iraq, like most countries in the region, it's a mixed picture. with a polarized society, and that's also consistent with a lot of countries in the region. While young people denounce the Shia religious parties, as Omar explained very eloquently, which came to power in 2003, there is also a segment of the population, namely the followers of Muqtada al-Sadr, who are far more religious and who do believe that Islam should play a role in governance. And I hope that we'll be hearing more about this from Sajjad, who is actually in Baghdad, as Omar mentioned. In many countries in the region, religion's place in society is very complex. And we see this also in the findings from this poll. 20 years ago, this is very different from 20 years ago, I guess when I started my research on this subject, when Western researchers tended to look really through a binary lens when we talked about religion in Arab societies. We either talked about secularists or we talked about Islamists, or particularly we talked about secularists versus Islamists. And I think that the picture now is far more complicated, as demonstrated by this polling. Iraq is a very interesting case study in this regard for many reasons. First of all, whenever we thought about opposition to Islamic influence, we always associated it with Sunni Islamists. The opposition in Iraq is about Shia Islamists who have come to power, and their ascendancy to power has created a lot of interesting literature, discourse, and debate in the region. And even though young people clearly state their opposition to Shia Islamist political figures in their demonstrations on social media, in the polling, the picture is very nuanced. In the EPIC survey, for example, 47% of the respondents said a secular democracy with a clear separation of religion and state is the best form of governance for Iraq. But when asked if Islam should be a source of legislation, 51% said it should be one among other sources of legislation. Only about 24% said Islam should not be a source of legislation, and this was equal to the 25% who said Islam should be the only source of legislation. So you could see the complexity when you compare the answers to the questions. In the EPIC poll, I think we're seeing a response to the post-2003 order, where sectarianism entered into politics and Shia Islamist parties caused profound government corruption, which led to high unemployment, which of course is off the charts today, and a lack of basic public services for the population. Shia parties, which have been involved in all sorts of processes in Iraq, from the constitutional process to the political process, are associated with religious influence and governance by Iraqis. And this is not only demonstrated in this poll, but many others since 2019, whether these parties are genuinely religious or not. So I think that what we've seen in numerous polls, including this one, is the skepticism of Iraqis. You know, that the religious parties, the Shia parties, use religion as an instrument to gain support and to advance their political agendas, but their religiosity is in question. And I think in this way, Iraq's political culture is evolving, whereby sectarianism and nationalism uneasily coexist. So I think that this is what has changed. You have sectarianism in politics, you have sectarian political figures, but you have a population moving toward more of a secular nationalist identity. Yet these two sort of schools of thought exist in the same country, and that's why there's conflict, and that's what they're trying to sort out at this point. When asked about the best system of governance for Iraq, 41% of the respondents said it was a civil democratic state that they preferred, where religion is a source of legislation, but religious parties are not allowed to hold positions in government. So I think that we have to be careful not to take the sort of opposition to religious parties and interpret that as either a movement against Islam or a movement against all clerics. And now I'll get to the role of the clerics, which was asked extensively in the survey. So the dynamics, as Omar mentioned, between the Iraqi state and the Shia clergy underwent a major transformation in 2003 from, of course, complete repression under Saddam Hussein to their rise to power in the state. And I think that the stated position of Iraq's high-ranking clerics, at least as it's often explained, and it's been explained to me as I've conducted interviews in Najaf and other places, is that their official position is that they don't enter into politics, into the political sphere. But in reality, of course, when you ask them, well, why did Sistani issue a fatwa calling upon all Iraqis to take up arms against the Islamic State? Why does he interfere when there's a polarizing prime minister who wants another term in office and he uses influence? The answer is, well, it's necessary to intervene to protect the public good of the population. And because Iraq has been undergoing so many crises for nearly 20 years now, there has been a need for clerics to enter the political sphere. And I think that, again, when we saw in 2019 the demonstrations, there were actually activists in Najaf that met with the clerics and, solicited their support for the demonstrations against the state. And Sistani was very instrumental in trying to broker some sort of peaceful agreement between the demonstrators and their demands and the state, however unsuccessfully that might have been. So the respondents to the EPIC survey, I think, are reacting to this reality of this kind of situation where clerics are quasi-state actors. So they're not officially state actors, but they're involved in decisions of the state. So 69% said the role of senior clerics in political affairs should decrease, with only 13% saying it should increase. So you can see that there's widespread belief that senior clerics should not be in political affairs. But when we break this down, when the polling broke it down according to sect, Shia and Sunni, 76% of Sunni respondents said their role should decrease, the clerics that is, while 51% of the Shia said so. When asked about the role of ordinary clerics, so lower-ranking clerics that people have more contact with, 80% of Shia respondents said the role should decrease, while 73% of Sunnis said it should decrease. So in conclusion, I think we're going to hear a lot more interesting observations from our two other speakers, I would say that the value of the survey is that it presents evidence of the nationalist, secularist trend in Iraq and the region, and the younger generation, while also making clear the ambiguities that exist between this whole question of religion and state and the role that religion should play in politics going forward. So as I mentioned, I think that Iraqis are redefining the political culture. We don't know what that redefinition will mean, but this poll is clearly evidence of the sort of contradictions and ambiguities in sorting this out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Genevieve. This is an incredible summary, I think, of the interesting findings of this report. These are remarkable figures, putting together the numbers. 88% of respondents in the survey wanted either an absolute secular democracy with complete separation between state and religion, or a civil democracy in which religious parties are not allowed to hold office, even if Islam was to be one source of legislation. And I want to bring in our other panelists, starting with Sajjad from Baghdad. I want to get your views on the situation on the ground. How, with this gap between public opinion and what the people want and what the people expect, and what the political parties have to offer with the formation of this new government that's dominated by the coordination framework that was announced last week. So you have this wide gap between public opinion and the parties, and also the fact that the government excludes another important segments of the of the public, which is the Sadrist movement. What do you see the outlook for this government? Is it destined to clash with large parts of the country from day one? Does it have will it have an opportunity to, experiment and prove itself, or is it doomed to fail?
Thank you, Omar, and it's good to find someone who's a bit more pessimistic than I am. So, yeah. Firstly, I would say the Islamist parties still have millions of voters and supporters, and they believe that they can continue to be successful. So in the elections, just the Fatah Alliance picked up well over 1 million votes. And if you put together all the number of votes that the coordination framework picked up, I think it's well over 2 million. So they believe that they legitimately formed a government. The Sadrists weren't able to, they failed, and that they have enough support in the country to carry on with their political project, that they are not going to suddenly have no supporters on the street, that there is no wide membership amongst different parts of the society. They have young people supporting them, and people in the state supporting them, people outside the state supporting them. They have people with weapons, without weapons. They have intellectuals supporting them. So the Islamist parties believe that they can continue successfully, maybe indefinitely. That's their belief. And I think the election results, despite the low turnout, maybe support some of that view, that they still have some grassroots support, including, of course, the Sadrists, who are also Islamist as well. People may seem to forget sometimes that the Sadrists ally themselves where they can with secular movements, but actually the Sadrists are Islamist, as you both pointed out. So when you add those numbers together, then the Sadrists plus the coordination framework have millions of supporters in Iraqi society, including among young people, the very same young people who we frequently hear about, who complain about services, who want secular democracy, for example. Amongst that segment, millions of them still support the Islamist party. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second is, I think Genève was absolutely correct that the poll shows some ambiguities, that a majority of people polled want a form of secular democracy, but at the same time are socially, religiously conservative. And I think that's what Iraqi society is moving towards more. The majority of people, and it doesn't mean everybody, but the majority of Iraqi people are still socially and religiously conservative. But the majority of people are becoming more in favor of secular politics rather than overtly Islamist politics. They don't want to see clerics in power. They don't want to see Islamist parties in power. Certainly, they don't want to see clerics and Islamists in government. And for that, I think that ambiguity is special to Iraq. People are religiously conservative, but not politically conservative in the same way. And so the framework has an opportunity. The formation of the Sudani government, because it was able to bring in other parties as well. So it brought in the KDP, the PUK, Taqaddum, Azim. It brought a bunch of other parties in with it. It's still dominated by the framework, the current government, the new government, but it has an opportunity to say, actually, we're quite representative of Iraqi society. The only party who's not with us at the moment are the Sadrists. But the framework will probably try to say that that's the problem. The Sadrists are the problem. Without them, the government will be running smoothly and we should be able to improve services. So I think people will be watching the performance of this government. Come next summer, do we have enough electricity? Have we improved the situation with climate change? And are there enough water resources for people? What have we done with the economy and providing jobs, for example? Maybe the Sudani government is able to buy itself some more time for another year or two. But I don't think just because of the way it was formed, people are suddenly going to come out and protest and say, hey, the Islamist parties are very strong and we're going to sort of bring this government down. I don't think that's on the cards at all. Instead, I think people want to see, can they deliver? Can they improve the situation for the average Iraqi? Have they learned from their mistakes? If not, then people will come around and say, hey, this government is just as bad as the previous ones. It doesn't matter how it was formed, how many parties are part of it. They are just as bad as the previous ones, and therefore we will support demonstrations and we will look to sort of pressure this government. They've promised early elections, so they've said they will try to organize within a year. Highly unlikely that will happen, but we don't expect this government to be able to, easily continue its 3-year term without opposition from the Sadrists, without protests as well.
Thank you, Sajjad. And I think I want to pivot on that point of elections, early elections being in the works. And I want to turn to Hamza here. There are, forces that are anti-muhassasa, anti-establishment in Iraq that are already trying to organize themselves to challenge this status quo, potentially in a new election. 2 weeks ago, we saw hundreds of activists from several groups that were part of the Tishreen movement, Nazil Akhud Haqqi, the Communist Party, and several other Bayt al-Iraqi, Bayt al-Watani. They came together in a large conference in Baghdad. They announced the formation of a new umbrella group with a long manifesto and a plan to work together to oppose the entrenched political establishment. I think they're called the Democratic Forces for Change. How significant is this? Secular political parties in the past in Iraq tend to perform poorly. And even when they performed well in elections, they were often easy to outmaneuver and marginalized by the dominant political parties, notorious case in 2010 between Iyad Allawi and Nour al-Maliki. What are the chances, what are the opportunities for a new coalition like this to avoid the mistakes of the past and learn from them and, potentially present an alternative? Is that possible?
Thank you, Omar. Great question. And I think you're seeing some development in Iraqi politics, especially amongst the new parties that are coming in. So a few of those that you just mentioned, they boycotted the elections in October 2021, and they got burnt. They saw parties like Imtidad, a new generation, win a lot of seats, and Imtidad gained even more seats after the Sadr movement resigned. And so they're now looking at other avenues within the system, within elections, within coalition building to play the game. And this is promising that they're looking at how to reform the system from within. This should be encouraged by everyone. They're not doing anything that's dangerous to the system or wanting to bring it down, but looking at reforming from within. So how likely are they able to make that change? It's going to be difficult. And to be honest, I'm actually more looking at the ones that are in parliament now, like Imtidad, like New Generation. I've met with a lot of Imtidad MPs and members of that organization the past year, and I asked them, how are you going to build that culture of opposition within parliament? You're not the ones that are looking to be part of the new government. You don't want a ministry. But what are you going to do different? What's that opposition going to truly look like? And there's been a lot of there hasn't been a lot of parliamentary sessions to really play that role this past year without a government. But now that we have one, it's going to be interesting to see how they do.
Thank you, Hamza. Hopefully, we'll see. You'll see them learn from the mistakes of the past and generate momentum, create that culture of opposition, which is sorely, I think, needed in Iraq's parliament. Geneva, I want to go back to you, and this is a question directly for you, but also I invite our other two speakers to also chime in if they would like to share. You mentioned in the report that throughout the 20th century, the Arab region has had three dominant ideologies that have, governed the states. It's either a monarchical family or dynasty, or religious identity, or a pan-Arab national identity. And Iraq has experienced, I think, the rise and fall of all three identities. We're looking around the region, countries that also had a similar path, like Egypt, monarchy, nationalism, religion, brief bout with religion during the Muslim Brotherhood period, is now reverting back to autocracy, to military autocracy. Is Iraq potentially, sliding back in that same direction because, following the failure of religious, political party rule, or is there something different about Iraq that could allow it to forge an Iraqi national identity, a country-specific identity? How do you see this clash or cycle of identities playing forward in Iraq?
Well, it's a really important question, and I think that, the reason that I think Iraq is such an important case study to examine identity in the region is that it's more, I would say it's almost more advanced, as you mentioned, than some other countries, certainly more advanced than Egypt, a country I'm very familiar with. And because of everything that we have seen in Iraq, particularly, I would say since 2015, when the demonstrations actually started, when you saw the real development of an opposition movement, all of these forces have come into play. So you have the religious forces, you have the younger generation becoming a lot more politically active, all in a backdrop of sort of economic disaster, political instability, ISIS. And I think that given that the country has survived all these crises, which are very serious, I see more optimism, and I'm not a very optimistic person ever when it comes to the Middle East, but I think that Iraq gives us reason to be optimistic that all of these issues about governance at some point in time will be sorted out. And as Hamza said, which is very important, is that the young parties that boycotted the elections, they learned a lesson, which is that it's much more effective to participate in the political system, however dysfunctional it might be, than to boycott, because they suffered from boycotting. And now there is a new opportunity for re-entering. So those that took the protest movement to the street, from the street to the ballot box, I think have done much better than those who boycotted. So I think all these factors that are in play at Iraq are going to lead to a different form of governance than we have really seen in the Middle East. And I would say that it will be a form of governance whereby the clergy probably still has a role to play in politics, as I said, not officially, but as quasi-actors, but that this can coexist with a state and with parties that are sort of non-religious. Or at least if they are identified in some Islamic way, that doesn't play into how they govern. So I think that one issue that Sajjad raises is very important, is that, we shouldn't confuse the sort of findings in the poll, and this poll, and also polls that the Arab Barometer have done, which are cited in the report, that this is an anti-Islamic kind of sentiment, that there's still a large role for religion to play in Iraqi society and will in the future, but that perhaps religion is not used to form laws. We're not talking about an Islamic form of governance, and there is a great difference. But I think I look at Iraq, and why I think it's such a fascinating country to study at this point in time is because all of these factors are at play at once. And they're, trying to sort out all these issues that other countries in the Middle East haven't really grappled with yet.
Thank you, Genevieve. And to add a footnote to that, I think in the survey, only 10% of respondents said that they would support that they thought that the theocratic system would be the best for Iraq, which I think says a lot. It gives us a little bit of optimism about what kind of system the people want and how much they want to curtail that kind of encroachment of potentially, the Iranian model of governance on Iraq. But I want to talk a little bit more about the role of the marja'iyya going forward. Sajjad, I want to turn to you, being our expert on Shia politics in Iraq on the ground. How do you see the role of the senior marja'iyya going forward during this government cycle? Is the marja'iyya going to, go back to an active role, seeing this business as usual kind of government as an existential threat to Iraq? Can we see potentially more, active cooperation between the activists demanding change and the marja'iyya kind of making a new push for change, for reforms? Or is the marja'iyya going to take a, go back to a more quietist mode?
So in November 2019, when the protests were at their peak, the UN Special Representative went to visit Ayatollah Sistani in Najaf, and Ayatollah Sistani expressed to her his extreme disappointment with the political elite. And I think if I paraphrase his words, it was something along the line of, they do not want to listen. And that's part of the problem, is that Sistani is a cleric. He has no means to force the politicians to listen. He cannot force them to reform. Protests have gone on several years, in 2011, 15, 16, 18, 19. and they've not managed to force the political elite to change. Yes, we had early elections. We had an improvement in the election law. But apart from that, it's very difficult to find successes from the pressure of protests. And part of that is because the political elite, as I said, have captured the system and believe they can continue successfully governing, in their eyes, successfully governing and remaining in power. And unfortunately, one of the examples they look at is Lebanon. Lebanon declared bankruptcy, yet it's still going. The political elite are still in power. They've gone through civil war, they've gone through so many crises, yet they're still going. They're still there, the same people, the same parties. And I think some of these political elite that we have are, in that mindset that, hey, we've got money, we've got weapons, we've got control of several parts of government, we have influence over the judiciary, over the legislature, we can keep going for a while. And so if they're not willing to listen, somebody like Ayatollah Sistani is not in a position to force them. He cannot force them to reform. And so, as Genevieve mentioned, he supports the formation of new parties. He supports the transparency that these new parties are calling for, transparency over how government is formed, how government is run, where our public finances go. Obviously, anti-corruption drives. He in one of his rarest interventions in 2015, he told the former Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi to strike corruption with an iron fist, by name, in very directly addressing the Prime Minister. That's very rare for somebody like him to do that. So part of the problem is the Marja'i want to preserve their political capital. They don't want to use it up too much. If they frequently chide and criticize and comment and nobody's listening, then it's really a waste of their breath and a waste of their political capital. So instead, they want to intervene only when it is the last resort. For example, the onslaught of ISIS and the collapse of the security forces required the Marja'i to intervene. That's their belief. So going forward, I don't think the Marja'i will intervene whenever they feel like it. Instead, I think unless there is a really serious crisis, more serious than we've seen, they're not going to intervene. Instead, they want the current political parties to change their methods. They want new parties and reformists to sort of be a bit more bold, to use, as Hamza pointed out, to use the system. So fight in elections, take part, for people to vote, for them to make clear what their policies are. Part of the problem in Iraq at the moment is that the parties don't actually disagree in their economic policies. They all want to increase the size of the state, the public sector payroll, to continue subsidies, to keep the control and command economy, control of the government over all aspects of production and economic output. They don't differ, whether it's the Sadris, whether it's the framework, whether it's all the other parties. And unfortunately, a lot of the young people who protest are calling for the same thing. We want public sector jobs. We want prices to come down. We want the government to distribute oil wealth. Well, what's the difference between their policies and those in power? So part of the problem is the new parties need to mature. They need to make clear what kind of policies they are going for, and for them to tell people why this is better for them in the long run. The social contract in Iraq is broken. We have neither the benefits of the social contract in the West, where you have representation and rights, you end up paying taxes, nor the social contract that occurs in, for example, in the Gulf countries. You give up your rights, but you have economic prosperity and security. We have the worst of both worlds and none of the benefits of the other side. So we need to clarify this going forward. What is it that we're looking for? If we want to return to autocracy, that means we give up democracy, we give up rights, but we can have prosperity and stability. Are we going for true democracy? That means then our people will need to give up some of the things that they want to have. We don't collect 90% of revenues for electricity. 90% of electricity is subsidized. We have a huge amount of subsidies, well over $20 billion per year, going for gas, food, and so many other things, transport, electricity, and this is unsustainable. So some of the change needs to occur within the Iraqi population. It's not just at the political level.
Thank you for keeping us grounded, Sajjad, keeping our expectations low. Hamza, I want to turn to you. Do you agree that Iraq is indefinitely stuck in this cycle of muhassasa and patronage networks that keeps everyone happy and distributes the dwindling amount of resources among a growing, population until everything is depleted? Or is Iraq, developed enough politically, and this is a point that Genevieve touched on earlier, is Iraq ready and politically developed enough to try and make a push to break the cycle of muhassasa and move into a less dysfunctional, more agile majoritarian government, perhaps not a Sadrist interpretation of majoritarian, but one that is more in line with the aspirations of the majority of the population? And if not, what do you think are the chief obstacles to preventing this from happening?
Thank you, Omar. I think I'm going to bring a bit of what Sajjad mentioned in this, and because we hear the word muhassasa a lot, and it being the barrier of making everything difficult. But I guarantee you, this new government, if it succeeds, and there's services, electricity, water, no one's going to be coming out and saying muhassasa is stopping the government. At the end of the day, it's the services being provided, and it's because of that we're against muhassasa. But if it worked, then no one would mention it. And I think a lot of the reasons why it doesn't work is not necessarily because of breaking things up against ethno-sectarian parties, but because it goes back to that social contract. We don't really have a clear social contract in Iraq and how we want to function. It goes back to what Sajjad was saying. The new parties, a lot of them, their economic policies are just like the old parties. And I've had conversations with civil society activists and organizations from Najaf to Mosul, and I've spoken to them and I said, you go out and you protest against the government. You want a strong state. That doesn't necessarily mean a stronger government. The people also need to be stronger. You need to take things into your own hands. If you keep depending on the government itself, then you're ultimately weak, and what you're protesting doesn't make sense. So I truly think we need to go a little deeper when it comes to Iraq, not blame everything just on muhassasa, because I've had people that claim it's muhassasa parties, not really ethno-sectarian groups. And yeah, it's just, I don't know if we have the time to go to that deep, Amar, but honestly, it actually makes me positive. I'm optimistic, because if we can change the social contract, change that mentality, then I think it's a lot more achievable when we look at it that way.
And the trick is going to be finding enough courage, I think, among both the political class and the public to support, creating that new social contract that puts Iraq on a more correct path, which is a big hope. Thank you to all of our panelists, but I want to turn to our audience here in the room. Ambassador Jeffrey, you have a question?
Sure. First of all, thanks again, everybody, including our friends Sajjad and Hamza from Iraq, in participating today. I had a question, but you sharpened the point of it a little bit in talking about 2010 and the religious party running circles around the more secular nationalist party under Iyad Allawi. As a minor actor in that drama, it gets to something that we have not yet heard today, yet I think is very important, and that is an outside state called Iran. What is Iran's role in the shaping of these religious parties and Shia religion in governance in Iraq? And I'll throw it open to everybody. Thank you.
Jeannie, would you like to take a first stab at it?
Sure. I think that we can't really overstate Iran's influence. Of course, there's a long history, theological history, and there's direct interference in the electoral process after elections are held, and we saw that in 2018. We saw it again in 2021. And it's difficult, I think, and perhaps our speakers who spend most of their time in Iraq can clarify this, but I think that what the question is, obviously Iran has a great role to play in Iraq, and it has religious influence, political influence, but I think that what is difficult for us to sort of parse out here in DC or in other places is, who are these players enabling Iran? And do they act independently at times? Because we've seen that, of course. We've seen the militias act independently of Iranian dictates. We've seen Islamists act independently of, so it's difficult to parse out of where their alliances fall at different times, and it's also difficult to figure out who is aligned and when, and at one point in time. I mean, Sadr is an exact example of this. You know, if you read the media reporting now, it's, oh, that Sadr is anti-Iran and Washington should support his rise to power again in Iraq because he's our best hope for any sort of future if we're concerned about Iranian influence. But is that really true? We don't know. I mean, we don't know sitting here if that's true or not. This is just sort of the media narrative of who Sadr is at this point in time. And the media narrative about him has been wrong most of the time over the last 15 years. So, so I think maybe the two of you could answer this question. If we want to use, say, the militias as an example, when are they aligned with Iran? When does Iran have influence and when doesn't it? And sort of maybe help us sort out where is Sadr at this point if we look at his affinities and alliances with Iran. I mean, someone told me the other day, who unfortunately isn't here, he's a professor at NDU, that he thinks all Sadr wants is to march through the streets of Najaf and declare himself the next Khamenei. That's ultimately what his objective is. And I thought that that was a very interesting observation. So anyway, I'd like to hear from, not to pass the buck, but maybe we can hear from you on this question too. Thank you.
Omar, if I can start off with some comments.
Sure, go ahead.
I like to, give a lot of agency to Iraqi politicians, both the failures and successes. And so when it comes to Iran, often in Washington, everyone's confused by Iraq and frustrated, but that's the same for those in Tehran as well. You just saw the longest government formation in Iraq, where we saw the least amount of interference from the United States. And so you could argue that Iran had more room to play, and yet it still took over a year to form a government. And so Iraqi politicians give the Iranians as much of a headache as they give the Americans. And I think that's important to keep in mind. But I'll allow Sajjad to talk about Sadr, but to add to my point, I think, for example, if Iraqi politicians in Baghdad and Erbil work together more, then you'd see a stronger Iraqi sovereignty. I don't think it's necessarily because of Iran, Iraq is weak, but I think it's because Iraqis disagree amongst themselves, which goes back to giving them the agency.
Okay, so I think you guys want me to talk about Sadr, is that right, Omar?
Sure.
All right.
Briefly.
Okay. So Sadr believes that he is the sole legitimate political representative of Iraq Shia. Him and his family suffered through the previous regime. They were inside Iraq while all these other parties were formed outside Iraq and benefited from its privileges, living in Iran, Syria, the UK, US, wherever. And he has more grassroots support. He believes the vast majority of Iraq Shias are Sadrists one way or another, that all these other parties were splintered from his movement by Iran, and therefore he, and by his showing in the last elections, he has the right to become the sole power that represents Iraq Shia. Now, the same belief may permeate across, or does permeate across, some of the other elements of Iraqi society. The KDP believes it is now the sole legitimate representative of Iraq's Kurdish population. Hamid Halbousi, the speaker, believes that he is now the sole legitimate political representative of Iraq Sunnis. That is why they formed that alliance together, because their ideology came across very well. It made a lot of sense. But what Muqtada Sadr underestimates is the fact that this is a fight for survival. It's not just about who comes into power. So therefore, he has to contend with Iran's interference, the interference of other countries, the divisions, even within his own alliances, the fact that the Iranian-backed parties will go to whatever means to protect their power. And when he's come across that, he's struggled to overcome them. So going forward, I think part of his strategy is to establish that he is more popular than they are, that he has more legitimacy than they are, that he is more independent than they are, that he is legitimately able to bring more people to vote for him than they are. And that's why he should be given a chance to form a government, that he will be able to perform better. Now, whether that's the reality or not, it doesn't matter. It's the image that he's trying to project. And I think the framework is going to struggle in the future to push back against that narrative. I think more and more Sadr will become stronger and stronger in Iraqi politics.
Thank you both. I think we have another question from the room. Please identify yourself.
All right, great. Thank you so much for a fabulous presentation. My name is Amit Ahuja. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center. I was very intrigued by the use of the phrase civic nationalism and just, you know, how nationalism was brought up when you were discussing some of the survey results. Now, a disgruntlement, if you want to call that with the clerics, or a desire to see a smaller role for religion in politics, doesn't necessarily mean nationalist politics. What I'm trying to get at here is, could the panelists, put some more description on what this nationalism or emergent nationalism, as you see it, looks like? What is this about? What are its attributes? So that's my first question. And another question, which is this, that, at some point, this notion of the state exercising the monopoly over violence is going to have to be dealt with. At the moment, that's not the case. And so, when we think about religious parties, when we think about the militia, just curious to know, where are the security forces in terms of their attitude, and the influence that, towards religion, and the influence that some of the religious parties and the religious militia have on the security forces? Thank you.
Okay, so we have two questions. Ginny, would you like to address the one on nationalism?
Sure, I'll be brief. I think that when we talk about nationalism in the Iraqi context, it's more of I would say, a movement against sectarianism. So the young people who've been demonstrating in Iraq now for several years, they have all sorts of nationalist slogans, some of which Omar mentioned in his introduction. And, they want to move away from being identified as Sunni, Shia, Christian, and so forth. And so I think that that's my brief observations in the Iraqi context. And I think that that's a bit different than other countries in the region, simply because there aren't so many ethnic groups in many Arab countries. So, when you talk about Egyptian identity, there's a lot of clarity in that kind of terminology of the Egyptian identity. In the Iraqi identity, there's a lot less clarity. And so I think that that's really the search. And I think I would just make one other point, which is that I think that as we've seen the younger generation talk about an Iraqi identity in the context of nationalism, it's to overcome these kinds of this political fragmentation and the political sectarianism that they have experienced. And that's why they form political parties and so forth. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you, Genevieve. And Hamza, I want to ask you to address the question on security forces. Why are Iraq's security forces not simply going ahead and crushing the militias and establishing state monopoly over violence? What's stopping them from doing that, being the largest organized military force in the country?
I think the short answer is political will from leadership. But to kind of delve deeper, I think we need to have less of, a Western American view on security, especially in other countries. Sometimes there's organized chaos. So look at Iraqi Kurdistan, for example. Their security organization is split between two parties, the KDP and the PUK, both in their Peshmerga and their intelligence services. And you can argue that these are, party militias, they're ethnic militias. But because they're not seen as much of a danger as other militias, they're not really talked about. But they're very similar in their organization, and they work. And it's the same thing in the rest of Iraq. I mean, I've been living in Baghdad for the last 3 years, and I don't drive around Baghdad and see, scary militias on the street. It's not so much in your face as the way you read it. Now, that doesn't take away from the threat they offer certain civil organizations, civil activists, their role in 2019 October protest movement and crushing them. But the point remains is that we need to be a little more nuanced when we analyze them and try to figure out a solution that's an Iraqi solution to them and not really a black and white American solution.
Thank you, Hamza. Any other questions? Jonathan, please.
Omar, thank you. My name is Jonathan Lord. I'm the Senior Fellow and Director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for New American Security. I just want to say thanks to our panelists. This has been fascinating. To Hamza's point, and I'd like to also welcome Hamza, who is the newest adjunct fellow to our program at CNAS. Very exciting to see him here. The need for a little more nuance, and if we could unpack the issue here. What I'm really hearing in today's discussion is that there are two distinct issues under discussion. One is the role of religion in the state and identity, versus the second issue, which is really the co-optation of religion for political purpose and agency. And the first issue, the former, doesn't seem all that, to my ear, unique to Iraq. I mean, we've seen this in other democracies, both developed and emerging democracies, where it's very much part of the public debate. What is the role of religion in legislation? I have not so fond memories of watching members of Congress rail on the floor of the House of Representatives about the creeping Sharia law in America, and then unironically state in the next breath that this is a Christian state. So obviously sort of bypassing the question of secularism as a role and the differences between state and religion. But that's something we see in America and a number of democracies around the world. The second, perhaps, is a little bit more unique to the Iraqi political system, whereas we have seen religion co-opted in certain respects by political parties for a number of reasons to turn out voters. The Sadrists, for instance, are incredibly capable at bringing voters to the polls, whereas we've seen secular movements otherwise sort of having given up on the electoral system. So there's a sort of an agency or an authority or an authenticity to religious leaders that drives people to be politically active. And it's also driven not so much muhassasa, but it's enabled corruption in some of the features by which these parties have been able to extract resources from the state and gather some degree of authenticity and agency. So I'm sort of curious how Iraqis view that particular nuance. Omar, your research seemed to be focused more on the former, but when we think of the challenges of evolving the Iraqi democracy, it seems that the issues of the latter seem to be more at play. So what is the role of the co-optation of religion in enabling the political practices we've seen among these parties, and how is that addressed or considered among the Iraqi political public? Thank you.
This to
whoever feels most excited to speak to that.
Sajjad, do you want to take a first stab at this?
No.
Not really, no. Like I say, I think the Iraqi population is still affected by what happened from 2003. Religious parties, Islamist parties, were the ones that took up power. They were the majority on the governing council. And then later on, they formed the first governments, the first government in 2005 and 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, 2022 now. So part of that is just because we've inherited in a short amount of time. I mean, it's not a huge amount of time, don't forget, that Iraq has had a democracy, that Islamist parties have always been in charge. And I think it's difficult for people to imagine a scenario where there's no Badr, there's no Asaib, there's no Sadrist, there's no Dawah party, there's, none of these exist. It's very difficult for people to see that. Part of that is just the generational change. As more and more Iraqis are born after 2003 and they become politically mature, they will not care about Saddam, the Iran-Iraq war. They will not care about Islamism. They will care about what is in it for me? Why is my country not as good as others? Jordan has 10% of our budget, almost none of the wealth that we have, yet it's in far better condition than Iraq is. Why is that the case? So more and more young people will be asking those questions. At the moment, I think 50% of Iraq's population is born after 2003. And I think well over 65% are born after 1990. Those numbers, will increase, and we'll come to a time where people will not remember events of 2003 or before 2003. They'll be focused on now. Why am I not employed? Why do I not have my rights? Why do I not have good services? And that's when they'll start to dismiss this idea of Shiism, Islamism, Sunni, ethno-sectarian. They won't care about any of this. They will be focused on, why is my government not delivering for me? So I think part of that is just a natural generational change that we are in the beginning of, that is just happening now. Remember, people who were born in 2003 are 19 now. They've just got to voting age. So with time, we will see more of this play out, I think.
Yeah. A 10-second footnote to that. Political parties have always exploited security crises to push people to entrench behind identity, behind religion and sect and ethnicity. And I think the first so-called civil war of 2006-07, that was, I think, a big boost, really, to the sectarian parties that gave them such a, dominant role in, quote unquote, protecting their communities. And they've been running, cruising on that since then. I'm being told that we're running out of time, and I sincerely apologize to our online audience for not having the opportunity to take their questions, but so we'll have to turn to Ambassador Jeffrey for some closing remarks.
I'm just going to summarize not everything we've heard today, because that would take another hour, but simply one thing that I've taken from this thing, which I'm really happy to hear, because it's a feeling I have, even though I started off with a pretty glum assessment of some of the problems that Iraq has had, and that is optimism. Look what the country has gone through. I mean, you can compare it to Jordan, but Jordan has not had the turbulent history that Iraq has had since 1979. How many wars? 3, 4? Counting the Islamic State, and tremendous turbulence. Nonetheless, Iraqis of different ethnic and religious backgrounds still get together to try to work these things out. They make some progress. There are all of the problems that we've discussed today, but I have to believe that there are real grounds for optimism, and I would like to thank most of all the Iraqis here, and particularly in Iraq, who are working so hard to advance their country under not particularly easy circumstances. So thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Hamza and Sajjad, and thank you, Genevieve. And thanks to our audience who joined us today.